We're in lesson number 4, where we're continuing our studies of the books of 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles and the events that are found there. We're going to really begin our study tonight in 1 Kings chapter 5, and we have a number of different chapters to cover in both 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles, but the fact of the matter is it really focuses on really two massive building projects that Solomon undertakes and their completion. First of all, it focuses on the Lord's house and Solomon's construction of the temple, but it also in 1 Kings, not so much 2 Chronicles, focus on his own building of his own house. And that is going to be the primary focus, really, of this section of Scripture, the construction of those two buildings as well as God's occupation and the dedication of the temple. In 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and verse 1, it kind of begins with this statement. It says, "Now Solomon decided to build a house for the name of the Lord and a royal palace for himself." As you kind of read that verse, as you're going along in 2 Chronicles, it's almost as if Solomon just woke up one day and decided on his own it's a good idea to build a house for the Lord. And not only a house for a Lord, but he also wanted to build a palace for himself. But that's not quite the picture. The fact of the matter is when we look in 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 5, we see it wasn't just Solomon's idea. It wasn't something he generated himself, but it was a reflection upon a promise that God made to David. It says in 1 Kings chapter 5 and verse 5, "Behold, I intend to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, as the Lord spoke to David my father, saying, Your son whom I will set on your throne in your place, he will build the house for my name." His intention was to follow through on the promise of God. This wasn't an idea that it came from his own mind or he generated. He thought it was just a good idea. He was acting upon the promise that God made to David. Now, the fact of the matter is, I'm going to tell you from this text, a lot had to go on and a lot had to work right for Solomon to begin engaging in this massive set of building projects this early in his reign. Now, first of all, if the Lord was for it, that's the first one. I mean, nothing was going to be successful unless the Lord had taken note of this and decided to bless this effort of Solomon. But to Solomon to start so early, in really the 4th year of his reign, to set about and have all of this materials together was all the work of someone else. Largely, one of the reason that Solomon was able to engage in these building projects was through the efforts of his father David. In two different places that we find that in 1 Chronicles chapter 22 and 1 Chronicles chapter 29. I want us to turn there for just a moment. I think this is an astounding text. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, and we're going to read the first 9 verses together, 1 Chronicles 29. It says there, "Then King David said to the entire assembly, My son Solomon, whom alone God has chosen, is still young and inexperienced, and the work is great, for the temple is not for man, but for the Lord God. Now with all my ability I have provided for the house of God this gold, the things of gold, and the silver, and the silver for the things of silver, and the bronze for the things of bronze, the iron for the things of iron, and wood for the things of wood, onyx stones and inlaid stones, stones of antimony, and stones of various colors, and all kinds of precious stones, and alabaster in abundance. Moreover, in my delight in the house of my God, the treasure I have of gold and silver, I give to the house of my God over and above all that I have provided for the holy temple, namely 3,000 talents of gold of the gold of Ophir, 7,000 talents of refined silver to overlay the walls of the buildings, and of gold for the things of gold, and of silver for the things of silver. That is for all the work done by the craftsman. Who then is willing to consecrate himself this day to the Lord? Then the rulers of the fathers' households, and the princes of the tribes of Israel, and the commanders of thousands of hundreds, with the overseers over the king's work, offered willingly. And for the service for the house of God, they gave 5,000 talents and 10,000 darics of gold, 10,000 talents of silver, and 18,000 talents of brass, and 100,000 talents of iron, Whoever possessed precious stones gave them to the treasury of the house of the Lord in the care of Jehiel the Gahashonite. Then the people rejoiced because they had offered so willingly, for they made their offering to the Lord with a whole heart. And David also rejoiced greatly. I'm going to tell you that I think that's an astounding text. I mean, there's a lot of numbers there. There's a lot of information that it seems really easy to glance over. But I'm going to just tell you this is something about the character of David that seems to also be taught to his son Solomon at an early age. So we see here David really in the sense in verse 2 how he was going to engage in this work with all of his ability. The fact is, we well remember when Mark led us in a study of David's life and earlier in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, how David had this thought, and even the prophets were going along with him, but God said, "You were not the man to build my house." Here in this text, it says Solomon, and he alone was going to be the builder of the text. And the reason I think that's astounding is David didn't let that disappointment from the Lord to take away from his joy or his zealousness in setting about doing what he could for the sake of Solomon. Now, why did he do that? You see there in 1 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 1, he talks about Solomon being young and inexperienced, and he saw that Solomon would have need, so David committed himself to this work. There's something else in this text that stands out to me. Really in verse 3, he says, "Moreover, in my delight in the house of my God." You see, David saw this as a personal commitment that he was making to the Lord. He wasn't just collecting funds and laying aside stone and other things that were going to be used in the temple. He saw this as a personal endeavor on his part, and he took joy in that. The fact is the temple wasn't built in his lifetime. But the fact is, David, looking ahead with the eyes of faith, took delight in the fact that the temple would be constructed, and he had a small part to play in it. I think that's amazing. Because in so many ways, I think this is really could be a description or should be a description of our service to the Lord even at this time. Did you see what he called upon the people to do in verse 5? He says, "Who then was willing to consecrate themselves this day?" You know what he's really asking for? He's asking for a donation, right? Who's going to give some money to the house of the Lord? But that's not how he phrases it. He first wants to see if people are willing to consecrate themselves to the Lord. That's how all true giving should work, right? You remember when Paul talked about the Macedonians, they first gave themselves to the Lord. That's really what drives our giving to the Lord, our sharing with others. It drives all of our service. We have first given ourselves. So David asked the question, have you set yourself apart for the Lord? And then what did they do after they gave? I find this fascinating too. And it says, then the people rejoiced. They rejoiced for the opportunity to give. They rejoiced for the amount they collected. And they rejoiced because they had a part or partial in this great work of God. So David set about and made preparations so that when Solomon took the throne, even at an early stage in his reign, he was able to engage in these great works of building. But I want to tell you, it wasn't just David. There had to be several other precursors really working in conjunction with the Lord to bring about the time to be auspicious and well to build the house of the Lord. And the first one's really taken up in 1 Kings chapter 5 in the first 12 verses. Most of that text is dedicated to talking about this covenant that he makes with King Hiram of Tyre, who had a covenant with his father David and seemed to be largely influenced by his father David, even so much so that he could talk about David's God. But there's some other factors in this text as well that are noteworthy. Look, if you will, at 1 Kings chapter 5, and look at specifically verse 4. It says, "But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side. There is neither adversary nor misfortune." That seems like just a passing comment, but it's a critical comment to think about how that enabled Solomon to focus his attention internally, to engage in these great civic works. When countries are at war or there's no stability, infrastructure falls apart. That's just the way it is. Leaders can't focus on the needs of the people. They can't build up infrastructure. But through God's blessing and Solomon's wisdom, they had rest on every side, and so Solomon could dedicate his time to building this temple and his own palace. But the other part of this, as we already mentioned, is this covenant that he made with King Hiram of Tyre. Tyre seemed to be one of those countries that was rich in both labor and resources, but didn't have a lot of internal industry. Their monetary gain was selling both the resources of their land and hiring their laborers out. But what we see happen with this relationship between Solomon and King Hiram was it was a covenant of need, mutual need. So what did Solomon primarily? He gave him some money, yeah, but a lot of times it was food that he gave. He fed his workers. And so Solomon received these resources and these skilled workers from King Hiram's court. So what does God say about all of this? Look at verse 12 of 1 Kings chapter 5. All of this is meant to be seen as evidence of Solomon's wisdom. It says in verse 12, the Lord gave wisdom to Solomon just as he had promised him, and there was peace between him and Solomon, and two of them made a covenant. So all of that was meant to be shown both God's blessing and Solomon's wisdom that is a result of God's blessing. This just didn't happen fortuitously. It didn't just happen. It wasn't just happenstance. This was God and his providence and his blessing through Solomon. The rest of chapter 5, though, is kind of taking up with creating a labor force. And it's, as you kind of read that list, you have to be struck by the amount of laborers. And what I mean by this is this doesn't represent all of them. It doesn't seem. So right here, if I did my math correctly, you've got basically 180,000 men or laborers of different types plus their overseers. Now in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, it talks about the aliens that he impressed into service. I take those to be two different labor forces. Some people think they're the same and they're meant to be overlapping. I will leave that to your judgment. But it seems like they're described in slightly different terms. And you're just struck by the labor force, right? I mean, yeah, this is a big building project. Yeah, but you're talking 180,000. This is bigger than most towns in the state of Kentucky, all engaged in building these two great buildings here. But what kind of strikes me about that is, what are you to do with this? I mean, is this a sign of Solomon's wisdom again? Or is this a sign that Solomon is beginning to act like some of the kings of the land? I'll tell you, you're struggling with it because there's a couple of factors in it. First of all, he acts much like his Egyptian overlords because over both labor forces, he puts overseers to rule over them and to make them work. Let's just turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 2 really quick. And you get a little, at the very end, 17 and 18, and we read where he brought in these foreign aliens or aliens to the land. It said, Solomon, verse 17 of 2 Chronicles chapter 2, Solomon numbered all the aliens who were in the land of Israel, following the census which his father David had taken, and 153,600 were found. He appointed 70,000 of them to carry loads, and 80,000 to quarry stones in the mountain, and 3,600 supervisors to make the people work. I'm just going to tell you, this doesn't seem like voluntary service on the part of either the Israelites or the aliens in the land. They're both levied and both impressed into work. And so what we even see beginning in this little section here is we kind of begin to see, just again, as we've noted already in the life of Solomon, some of these little elements that just cause us to stop and shake our head or wonder, is He is wise, and he applies his wisdom in so many different areas, but he doesn't often apply the wisdom to himself. And so we have this inkling of things that may go wrong. But I think there's something neat in this. We read that account in 2 Chronicles chapter 2, but we also look in 1 Kings chapter 7. And I think this is just kind of a cool, maybe, element. I don't know if I would call it a foreshadowing exactly or a type. But so in 1 Kings chapter 7, we have a man by the name of Hiram, or Huram, depending on your translation. His mother was of the tribe of Naphtali, but his father was a foreigner. So what we have here is both in 2 Chronicles chapter 2 and 1 Kings chapter 7 is Gentiles, non-Israelites, were engaged in raising up this temple to the Lord. Now again, I don't know how far to press that. Is that really intended to be a shadow of where all people would come to the Lord? But I do find it interesting that in so many other areas regarding the temple, like they couldn't quarry stones on the site. There are no hammer blows. All the gold had to be the purest quality, no mixed with dross. But yet the workforce could be Gentiles as they raised these two great structures that Solomon was engaged in. Just an interesting aside. So I want to just take just a few minutes and talk a little bit about Solomon's building schedule, especially regarding the temple. There's certain key passages and verses throughout Scripture, like 2 Samuel 7. 2 Samuel 7, you should have a star by it. That's just one of those critical texts and throughout all the Old Testament. 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, at least as it relates to chronology, is probably one of the key texts in the Old Testament, because so much of what we know about the dating of the Old Testament is tied to the mentions of 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1. So let's just read that text. It says, "Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Zib, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." So, from secular sources, and pretty consistent, and really we're pretty confident, we can date Solomon's reign running from 971 to 931 BC. That doesn't come from Scripture. Those are from secular sources, annals of the kings, related comments from other dignitaries in the surrounding areas, even from the courts of the pharaohs. So that represented his 40-year reign. It says he began to build the temple in his 4th year of his reign. And that would put it roughly about 966 BC. That's in the 2nd month, the month of Zib, is when he began to build the temple. And it has this interesting fact in there. That is 480 years from the time of the Exodus, when the people had left Egypt. The time of the Exodus. That's when he began to build this temple. You know, an interesting fact, roughly 430 years after this fact is when the Zerubbabel and them began to rebuild their temple. Almost roughly the exact same time sequence. And then he completes the temple in 7.5 years. We're told 7 years specifically in the text, but then you've got to do the math on the months. So roughly 7.5 years is what it took to build his temple there in Jerusalem. Now, so that's just a time stamp. But one of the interesting things about that is that 480-year period from the Exodus to the time of the building. I'm going to just give you a couple of thoughts that you'll read as if you read any external material. Some people say that is meant to be kind of a general term to represent 12 generations. So sometimes that's an idea that people propose. Other people look at it as 400 literal years, but it depends on where it falls in the time of the Exodus. But I think the key element is the Exodus is now over. And God is now dwelling permanently in his people, with his people. I think the reference to Exodus is meant to be a typology, a reference to the fact what is being transpiring now. Before God went with them in the pillar of cloud and the cloud and the pillar of fire, He dwelt with them in the tabernacle, but now the Lord's house is going to be built, a place for the glory of the name of the Lord, and he was going to inhabit this temple and be with his people in a more permanent way. The Exodus was now over. The time of sojourn, at least as represented by the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings, are over, and the people are going to be established in Jerusalem. I think seems to be that's what's going to play out in 1 Kings and 2 Chronicles. So that kind of building schedule kind of just is noteworthy to look at. So I also want to just take just a moment to look at the structure of the story, particularly 1 Kings, because 2 Chronicles doesn't even have a reference, really much reference to the building of Solomon's palace. But just notice how it was. So 1 Kings 5, preparation for building. 6, building the Lord's house. 7, 1 through 12, that's Solomon's palace. 13 through 51, Hiram or Huram's work, the components in the temple. And then chapter 8, the dedication of the temple. Again, this is one of those things that you're going to kind of wrestle with as we wrestle with Solomon. Yes, it's true that he's got two great works that are being built simultaneously. They coincide each other in building. But the fact of the matter is we start looking at these references in 1 Kings, the palace is twice the size of the temple. It takes twice as long, basically, to build it. And so all along, while Solomon seems to be focusing on the Lord's house and giving it preeminence, also at the same time, he is somewhat divided and still looking to his own house. That seems to be kind of a message that's going to be played out in 1 Kings, this kind of a little bit of a divided mind that we see with Solomon. So let's just think a little bit about the house, the buildings that he built. And let's just first look at his palace. In chapter 7, verses 1 through 12, we have his palace described. It has 5 main components. It's called the Palace of the Forest. It's got the Hall of Pillars, the Hall of Justice. We have Solomon's personal dwelling, and then a separate building for Pharaoh's daughter. Now, people don't know, does that mean she was his favorite king, or that was part of the covenant with Egypt? I don't know. But she had her own part of the temple. And this temple would also be adjoining the temple of the Lord, so they would be in close proximity to one another. So when we read those names or those descriptions of the palace, they're not very descriptive. They don't tell us everything that was going on there. So, for example, like the Hall of Justice, many people, maybe also the armory also. So there were other things going on there. And this was not just for Solomon and his immediate family. This represented the place where all the civic activity, the administrative and judicial activity would take place. This was both his house and the entire government center kind of merged together in one place. And we look at it, and it is magnificent, apparently. I mean, when you read the first 12 verses of chapter 7, some words just kind of keep up. Some of the same words we read about the temple, the cedar. We see all these comments about these artistically designed windows. We look at verses 9 through 11. They emphasize these costly stones that were part of the building. And just understand that Solomon's place to dwell in many respects rivaled, if not exceeded, the place where God's name was going to dwell. I mean, at the very least, it's on the same level of luxury. I mean, as far as its building components and everything else. But it far eclipsed it as far as size. So then we move to the temple itself. And the temple itself, this is one of Matt's maps that I've already put on, or he kindly, graciously gave me and put on the screen here for you. Roughly the temple is, if we think about it, it's roughly 90 by 30 feet. Now, I say that's kind of around there, because we never know what is a cubit, is a royal cubit, what is the actual measurement of a cubit. But just think about it. So this building, first of all, before we get into the rest of it, it's 90 by 30. Okay? It's 3 stories tall, but the outside perimeter is 90 by 30. How many of your houses are bigger than that? Fact of the matter is, I kind of measured, I looked at the blueprints, and I did some measuring over here. Usually this temple, not the courtyards, the building itself, 2 of them would probably fit in this sanctuary here, this auditorium here, the place where we're sitting. And that's going to serve the religious, for the entire nation. So 2 of those would largely fit in this auditorium here, 2,700 square feet. And so we look at this building, even though it's 3 stories tall, that's the footprint of the temple itself. And it points out a number of things in 1 Kings chapter 6 about just the reference to the temple. I mean, it talks about this uncovered porch that goes along the front of it. It gives descriptions for the side rooms. It gives us all of these details regarding the insight into it. How no hammer blow was to be on the work side or anything like that. It talked about the interior furnishings, from the planks and beams of cedars to also being overlaid with gold. And just understand, this great work, it's going to stand for the next 400 years. I mean that's pretty amazing. Even our day and age, it's going to stand for the next 400 years. And then when the people come back, this is the thing that they rebuild. They don't rebuild Solomon's palace. They rebuild the place where God is going to dwell. This is what the people had longed for and looked at. Now, most of this, I'll just tell you, we could have an entire quarter on a study of the temple or more. But we got one night, so we just have to pick and choose. When we look at the temple, I think there's things that we look at. We often, as people, we look at the imagery and the carvings and the details of the temple, and we look at them from a couple of different perspectives. Sometimes we look at them from the perspective of what they meant from the past, iconography, the study of symbols. So, and that's the idea of looking at all of the images, the carved images, the reliefs, and looking to the past. Where did they come from? But more often than not, we always look to the future, right? We look to the fact that these are meant to be types or shadows that are to come before. I mean, we think about a passage like Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 5. He talks about the tabernacle, which really the temple is almost a scale model of the tabernacle in many respects, who serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. So we look at the tabernacle and we look forward. Or we look at the acts of worship in the Old Testament and we look forward. I'm going to suggest to you, I think that's a really valuable way to look at these, but we also need to kind of look from the past, because these elements, these symbols, and these figures are from the beginning all the way up. There's a reason that we find them in the Lord's temple, and the reason they continue to shadow things in the future. And I pulled out 4 just to kind of just look at with us tonight quickly. And the first one is the cherubim that are found in 1 Kings chapter 6 and verses 23 through 28. It says in verse 23, "Also in the inner sanctum he made 2 cherubim of olive wood, each 10 cubits high." And then he goes on to describe them, how they would take up basically the entire width of this room. Basically 15-foot tall cherubim in this room. Pretty much the most dominant feature in this room. And you just look at that, and what is that to convey both to the worshipers when they would come and the priest who would think about it and approach God? And what is it ultimately even to mean to us? I tell you, when you start looking back, your first, at least for me, I go all the way back to the garden, right? When God departed, when God cast Adam and Eve from the garden, he set cherubim to guard the gate, to keep them from coming back into the presence of God. And then later on, it seems to be kind of a guardianship, as we talk about in Ezekiel chapter 28. And is also, they were used for God's personal chariot and his throne. But I think the idea with all of those, when you kind of merge those things together, is that which was once separated by these cherubim are now with the people of God. There's this sense of closeness. When they draw near to this place, they are drawing near to God. And these cherubim, who are signifiers of the Holy One's presence, are there. They're just not pretty pictures. They're meant to convey ideas and to transmit ideas to the people. We kind of move ahead, and this is kind of tied to it. We look at all the reliefs carved into the wall. So many of them are related to garden-like themes, aren't they? They're palm trees and open blossoms and things about that. What garden do you think about in the Old Testament, right? You think about the Garden of Eden, don't you? And what was principally about the Garden of Eden? It was the fact that man and God were walking together, isn't it? That they had this relationship that was going to be severed by sin, but at the time it was a closeness, it's an intimacy. It was God was dwelling with his creation. And you look at this imagery and you look at how it's used throughout Scripture, it's used to convey those kinds of ideas. I mean, when we talk about flowers and trees, I'm going to just tell you that seems to be a consistent theme to talk about relationship and blessing from God. Turn over to Isaiah chapter 35 really quickly. And this is even looking ahead, prophesying ahead to the time of the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 35. But just notice some of these images. The wilderness and the desert will be glad, and the Arabah will rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It will blossom profusely and rejoice with rejoicing and shout of joy, and the glory of Lebanon will be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon, and they will see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. And it continues on down through there with all of this garden-type imagery to say that when you're in the presence of God, that's what it's like. It's this profusion. It's an indication of a return of this relationship. I think that's all the way through all the Old Testament. God always wanted to walk with his people, and that's what we see in Genesis chapter 3. We see it in Leviticus chapter 26, Deuteronomy chapter 23, and even 2 Chronicles 7. When he comes in and fills the temple, God wants to be with his creation. He wants to walk with them. What about these things? These two big, humongous brass columns that don't support a roof. I mean, they're just there, as far as I can tell. I mean, these things are massive. I mean, you talk about the heights of these things. I mean, these bronze pillars are 27 feet high, not counting the Capitol, the very top piece, and they're 18 feet in circumference, bigger than I can reach my arms around. It takes several of us to reach around. That's the circumference, these massive pillars. And Hiram built these, and he gave them names. Joshin, he establishes, or Boaz, in him is strength. And really, as they would come into the temple, or they would see the temple, they would see these giant pillars and realize that their entire world, their prosperity, that their blessing, all rest with God. I mean, he's the support. I mean, that's what pillars do, right? He establishes. In him is strength. I mean, it's just a visual reminder of who God is meant to be to his people when they would draw near to him. And then, quickly, one more. I've just found this. I mean, look over in 2 Chronicles chapter 4. Many of the artifacts in the temple were overlaid with gold, and there is a repetition of a word that it seems to stress an idea in 2 Chronicles chapter 4. (19 through 22), and it just, as we begin, I can't even speak. So, we have all of these references to these ideas of pure gold, of gold that is pure, it's undiluted, all of these different things that point us to this idea of the gold, any of the trappings that were to use or to be overcovered was to be unsmirched or unmixed. And even in its construction, I think it's teaching lessons of the types of people who would get to come near to God. It stresses the ideas of purity. Remember that lesson back in Leviticus chapter 10 and verse 3? That I will be treated, anyone who draws near to me, I will be treated as holy. In Isaiah chapter 52 and verse 11, those have to be pure who would carry the vessels of the Lord. And that maybe is a point of all of these different references. Everything that the Lord uses must be pure. Now, for some of you, this may seem a lot speculative, and it may be to some degree. We can't say with 100% certainty. But the proliferation and the repetition of these images that occur over and over again ought to stress to us the importance and try to put ourselves in the sandals or the shoes of those worshipers who would see Solomon's temple and see these images and what it would have meant and the ideas that it might have conveyed to them. So, the last part that we deal with is found in 1 Kings chapter 8, and it is Solomon's prayer and the dedication of the temple itself. It occurred during the festival of booths, is when the dedication of the temple was chosen to when this time was celebrated. The festival of booths is really a reminder again, the wilderness wandering's over, the period of Exodus is over. That's the tabernacle, that period was over, and they chose this time to celebrate and go into the temple. And much of what Solomon talks about in this text is centered upon God's covenant with David and his continued faithfulness to the covenant with his people. Let's just read 1 Kings chapter 8 and just read verses 25 through 30. He says there, "Now therefore, O Lord, the God of Israel, keep with your servant David, my father, that which you have promised him, saying, you shall not lack a man to sit on the throne of Israel. If only your sons take heed to walk their way, to walk before me as you have walked. Now therefore, O God of Israel, let your word, I pray, be confirmed, which you have spoken to your servant, my father David. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house which I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his supplication, O Lord my God, to listen to the cry and to the prayer which your servant prays before you today, that your eyes may be open toward this house night and day, toward the place which you have said, my name shall be there, to listen to the prayer which your servant shall pray to this place. Listen to the supplication of your servant and of your people Israel when they pray toward this place, here in heaven, your dwelling place, hear and forgive." So he talks about the covenant, and that is the first part of this section, in reminding of the covenant that God made with his father David, but the covenant that he has always had with his people. And he puts that condition in there that we see repeated, as long as they continue to walk in your ways. But then it changes, and the rest of Solomon's prayer is focused upon God, pleading with God that he would hear their prayers and respond to their prayers. In just those short verses, prayers mentioned 7 times. Words hear and listen are mentioned 6 times. Just to try to emphasize what Solomon was really pleading with the Lord. First, don't forget us. Secondly, whenever we mess up, hear our prayers to you. When we mess up, when we sin, when we transgress this covenant, don't turn your ear away from us. Listen to our prayers and our petitions before you. And he goes through the rest of that almost verbatim, Deuteronomy chapter 28, and envisions each circumstance, how the people would transgress and receive a curse. And he says, please God, listen to our prayers. Now, then, even though it's not contained in 1 Kings, we have this in 2 Chronicles where the Lord's glory enters the temple. And then Solomon and them have to offer sacrifices to the Lord. And let's just read his glory and then we'll be out of time. Now when Solomon had finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And the glory of the Lord filled the house, and the priest could not enter the house of the Lord, because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. And all the sons of Israel, seeing the fire come down and the glory of the Lord upon the house, bowed down on the pavement with their faces to the ground, and they worshipped and gave praise to the Lord, saying, certainly he is good, and certainly his faithfulness is everlasting. I can't imagine being there in that scene. And you see the appropriate response. They bow down. This work that we engaged in, we know is too insignificant, but you choose to dwell there and listen to us and hear our prayers. And his glory enters the temple. I would just offer this one application just for your consideration. We won't go into it tonight. But I think it's interesting that the parallels between Solomon and Jesus and Solomon's temple and Jesus. I think there are some things that you might think about. I mean, when we read in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, it's describing Solomon, but the fact is it could be describing Christ and his kingdom. We look here how Solomon's a man of wisdom, the greatest wise man of his age, but all wisdom rests with Christ in Colossians chapter 2 and verse 3. And here we see this temple. But what did Jesus say is the temple? I mean, in his body. And when we look in Revelation chapter 21 and 22, it says there's no need for a temple there, for God and his Son are the temple. So I just think it's an interesting thing to look at together. So I think we're out of time. The bell will be ringing momentarily. Thank you for your kind attention. We had to hurry through a lot of chapters there. It's a great text. I hope you'll continue reading and studying it for yourself. Thank you.